The Hammer bloodline operated as the corrupt connective tissue between the Kremlin and the White House for nearly a century. Julius Hammer forged the clan's path in a prison cell, a radical communist doctor locked away after a botched illegal abortion. His son, Armand, scaled that criminal instinct into a geopolitical force, transforming Soviet espionage connections into Occidental Petroleum, a global machine fueled by dirty energy and dictators. The Hammers hid their treason behind a mask of philanthropy. Yet beneath the art collections lay a rotting foundation of bribery and psychological torture. From the back alleys of the Bronx to the burning oil platforms of the North Sea, the Hammer name was bought with silence, only to be dismantled by the very secrets they kept. The birth of a red capitalist, the Hammer dynasty was forged in the radical revolutionary fervor of the Russian Pale of Settlement. Its foundation was built on the ideological fanaticism of the patriarch, Julius Hammer. Born in Odessa in 1874, Julius fled the anti-Semitic pogroms of Tsarist Russia for the United States. When he settled in the Bronx in the 1890s, he did not leave the revolution behind. He weaponized it. Julius was a man of terrifying energy and intellect. He put himself through medical school at Columbia University, becoming a gynecologist and a pharmaceutical entrepreneur. By day, he ran a successful chain of drugstores called Allied Drug and Chemical. By night, he was a dedicated card-carrying member of the Socialist Labor Party. He named his first son, born in New York in 1898, Armand, a name widely rumored to be a homage to the arm and hammer, symbol of the socialist labor movement, though the family would later vehemently deny this, claiming it was inspired by the character Armand in Camille. From the very beginning, the Hammers lived a dangerous double life. They were wealthy, bourgeois Americans, living in a mansion and being chauffeured through the streets of New York, yet they were intimately involved in the financing of the Bolshevik Revolution. Julius was not just a sympathizer, he was a key financial conduit. When the U.S. government cracked down on radicalism during the first Red Scare of 1919, the official Soviet diplomatic mission in New York was expelled. Julius Hammer stepped into the void, becoming the de facto ambassador for the new Soviet state. He used his pharmaceutical business, Allied Drug, to launder funds and procure medical supplies and chemicals, to send back to the motherland, effectively running a sanctions-busting operation from a drugstore in the Bronx. But in 1919, the family's precarious balance of capitalism and communism collapsed due to a sordid domestic tragedy. A woman named Marie Oganesov, the wife of a former Tsarist diplomat, came to Julius Hammer seeking an abortion. At the time, the procedure was strictly illegal. Julius performed the operation in his home office. Oganesov developed a severe infection and died days later. The death was a sensation. Julius Hammer was arrested, charged with first-degree manslaughter, and sentenced to 3 to 12 years in Sing Sing prison. The patriarch was removed from the board, creating an immediate crisis for the dynasty. The family business was leaderless, and the Soviet contacts were waiting. Into this vacuum stepped the 21-year-old Armand Hammer. Armand was a medical student at Columbia at the time, brilliant but ruthless. With his father in a prison cell, he took control of Allied Drug. But he realized that the family's future lay not in the competitive markets of New York, but in the chaos of Moscow. In 1921, newly graduated as a doctor, but having never practiced medicine, Armand decided to go to Russia. He framed the trip as a humanitarian medical mission to help the famine-stricken Soviet Union, purchasing a surplus U.S. Army field hospital to take with him. His true mission, however, was commercial. He went to collect the debts owed to his father and to secure the family's position with the new regime. He arrived in a Russia that was devastated by civil war, disease, and famine. The economy had collapsed. But where others saw misery, Armand Hammer saw a captive market with zero competition. He traveled to the Ural Mountains, ostensibly to inspect the medical situation. What he found was a landscape rich in resources, but starving for food. He saw mountains of furs, hides, and caviar sitting in warehouses, worthless because the Soviets had no way to sell them to the West. Meanwhile, the people were eating bark and clay. Armand sent a cable to his brother in New York. He proposed a massive barter deal. He would arrange for a shipment of 1 million bushels of American wheat to feed the starving Russians. In exchange, the Soviets would pay him in furs and caviar. The deal caught the attention of the highest power in the land. In October 1921, Armand Hammer was summoned to the Kremlin for a private audience with Vladimir Lenin. This meeting is the foundational myth of the Hammer Empire. Lenin, the leader of the World Revolution, was desperate. He realized that pure communism was failing to feed his people and that he needed Western capital to jumpstart the economy, the new economic policy. He saw in the young Russian-speaking American doctor a useful tool, a pathbreaker who could convince other American capitalists that it was safe to do business with the Reds. "We do not need doctors," Lenin famously told the 23-year-old Armand. "We need businessmen." Lenin offered Armand a deal that no other Westerner could get. He granted him a concession to operate an asbestos mine in the Ural Mountains, the first foreign concession in Soviet history. He promised Armand personal protection and a monopoly. In that moment, Armand Hammer ceased to be a doctor. He became the chosen capitalist of the Kremlin, the bridge between Wall Street and the Politburo. For the next 9 years, 1921 to 1930, Armand Hammer lived in Moscow, like a prince of the proletariat. He moved into a lavish mansion known as the Brown House, staffed by servants and filled with antiques. He became the primary fixer for every major American company trying to enter the Soviet market, including Ford Motor Company. He took a commission on everything, but his most lucrative venture was the A. Hammer Pencil Company. Armand noticed that the Soviet bureaucracy was expanding rapidly, but the country couldn't produce decent writing instruments. He imported German technology and American graphite, setting up a factory in Moscow. Within a year, he was producing millions of pencils, supplying the entire Soviet Union. It was a perfect cynical operation. The Hammers were teaching the Soviets how to read, write, and sign death warrants using American manufacturing, while the profits were funneled into secret Swiss bank accounts. However, the true wealth of the Hammer dynasty during this period came from a darker source, the looting of the Romanovs. The Bolsheviks had seized the palaces of the Tsar and the Russian aristocracy, which were filled with priceless treasures: Fabergé eggs, icons, tapestries, silverware, and paintings by old masters. But the Soviets had no way to monetize this loot. They were pariahs in the Western art world. Lenin and his successors needed hard currency to buy industrial machinery. Armand Hammer became their fence. He realized that he could buy these treasures for pennies on the dollar in Moscow and sell them for a fortune in New York and London. He began to fill his warehouse with the spoils of the revolution. He bought the Tsar's personal silverware, his icons, and his eggs. He created a narrative that he was saving these items, but in reality he was liquidating the heritage of a murdered dynasty to fund the regime that killed them. As the 1920s drew to a close, the political climate in Moscow began to shift ominously. Lenin died in 1924, and by the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin was consolidating absolute power. Stalin was paranoid, xenophobic, and deeply distrustful of foreign concessions. He began to nationalize Western businesses and purge those with foreign connections. Armand Hammer, with his survival instincts honed in the Bronx, sensed the danger. He realized his time as the Prince of Moscow was ending. In 1930, he liquidated his Soviet assets, packed up his mansion, including thousands of pieces of Romanov art, both genuine and dubious, and fled back to the safety of the United States. He returned to an America in the grip of the Great Depression. The market for high-end art had collapsed. The Gilded Age millionaires were broke. But Hammer, ever the hustler, pivoted. He launched a traveling circus of Romanov wealth, selling his crown jewels not at Christie's, but in the aisles of department stores like Lord and Taylor and Gimbel's across the Midwest. He pitched the treasures of the murdered czar to middle-class housewives, selling them a piece of royal tragedy for a few $100s. It was a brilliant commercial success, but it masked a darker reality. Art historians and intelligence analysts would later allege that Hammer continued to act as a fence for the Soviet state throughout the 1930s, selling off stolen assets to generate hard currency for Stalin's industrialization. Even more damning were rumors that many of the Fabergé items were actually high-quality counterfeits, manufactured in Soviet workshops using original stamps specifically for Hammer to sell to gullible Americans. As the 1940s dawned and World War II approached, Hammer reinvented himself again. Anticipating the end of Prohibition, he entered the alcohol business. But he didn't just distill whiskey. He engaged in war profiteering on a massive scale. With grain rationed for the war effort, Hammer found a loophole: potatoes. He bought millions of pounds of surplus, rotting potatoes from the government, and distilled them into commercial alcohol, blending it with whiskey stocks he had bought at fire sale prices. The result, branded as J.W. Dant, made him a fortune. By 1946, the Bolshevik doctor had become the whiskey king. Yet the shadow of his past remained. Throughout this period, the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, maintained a thick dossier on the Hammer family. They suspected Armand of being a key financier for Soviet intelligence networks in the U.S., a suspicion later supported by declassified Venona intercepts. But Hammer bought protection. He became a major donor to the Democratic Party, cultivating a friendship with Franklin D. Roosevelt that rendered him politically untouchable. By 1956, Armand Hammer was 58 years old. He was fabulously wealthy, politically connected, and technically retired. He moved to Los Angeles with his third wife, Frances, intending to live out his days as a gentleman art collector. But he needed a tax shelter. His accountant suggested he invest in a failing business to generate losses that would offset his income. The accountant found the perfect corpse, a tiny moribund firm called Occidental Petroleum. Based in a shack in Los Angeles, Occidental had a net worth of $34,000 and a few rusty, mud-clogged wells. It was effectively bankrupt. In 1956, Hammer wrote a check for $50,000, money he fully expected to lose. He authorized the drilling of 2 exploratory wells on a dead lease near Bakersfield, assuming they would come up dry and give him his tax write-off. But the Hammer luck intervened. The first well struck oil, then the second. Hammer was stunned. He had bet on failure and won success. Intoxicated by the thrill, he ousted the management and took over as CEO. He didn't know it yet, but the tax shelter he had just bought was about to become the vehicle for his greatest and most dangerous act of reinvention. The prologue was over. The era of the oil baron had begun. How a tax shelter defeated the 7 sisters. Armand Hammer broke the global oil cartel by accident. In 1956, the 58-year-old tycoon had no intention of becoming an oil man. He was simply looking for a tax shelter. He was technically retired, having already lived 3 distinct lives: the abortionist medical student, the Bolshevik capitalist who traded with Lenin, and the fence for Romanov treasures. Living in Los Angeles, wealthy but bored, Hammer needed a failing company to generate losses and shield his fortune from the IRS. In the high-tax environment of Eisenhower's America, losing money was just as important as making it. A friend advised him to look at a tiny moribund firm called Occidental Petroleum. At the time, Occidental was less a corporation than a corpse. It had a net worth of $34,000, 3 employees, and a handful of depleted, mud-clogged wells in the dusty scrubland near Bakersfield, California. It was worthless, which made it perfect for Hammer's accounting needs. He lent the company $50,000 to drill 2 exploratory wells. The geology reports were dismal. The land had been picked over by larger companies for decades. Hammer fully expected the wells to come up dry, which would allow him to write off the investment as a tax loss. It was a bet made to lose, but the universe had a different plan for Armand Hammer. The first well, drilled on a lease that everyone said was barren, struck oil. Then the second well struck. Then a third. It was the return of the legendary Hammer luck, a phenomenon that would haunt his rivals for the next 30 years. Suddenly, the tax shelter was profitable. Hammer, intoxicated by the sudden influx of cash and the thrill of the gamble, decided he wasn't going to liquidate the company. He was going to run it. He pushed aside the existing management and installed himself as chairman and CEO. He began to apply the same relentless, aggressive tactics he had used in the Soviet grain trade to the California oil patch. In 1961, his luck turned into a bonanza. Occidental drilled in the Lathrop field near San Francisco and discovered one of the largest natural gas deposits in California history. The company's stock, which had traded for pennies, exploded to $14 a share. Hammer was rich and Occidental was real, but to Hammer's boundless ego, being a successful California wildcatter was provincial. He looked at the titans of the industry, the Rockefellers of Standard Oil, the aristocrats of British Petroleum, and he wanted to sit at their table. The global oil market of the 1960s was a closed shop ruled by an oligopoly known as the Seven Sisters. These 7 giants, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, Gulf, Shell, and BP, controlled virtually every drop of oil in the Middle East. They operated like sovereign nations, carving up countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia into exclusive concessions. They set the prices, they controlled the supply, and they ruthlessly crushed any independent upstart that tried to muscle into their territory. Hammer knew he couldn't compete with the Seven Sisters in established markets. He didn't have the capital or the political cover. He needed to find a frontier, a place that was too risky, too unstable, or too overlooked for the giants to fully dominate. He needed a country where business was done, not through corporate committees, but through personal relationships. He found it in the desert kingdom of Libya. In the mid-1960s, Libya was a vast arid wasteland ruled by the aging pious king Idris. Oil had been discovered there in 1959, but the country was still considered a second-tier producer compared to the massive reservoirs of the Persian Gulf. The Seven Sisters had concessions there, but they were moving slowly, treating Libya as a strategic reserve rather than a priority. The Libyan government, feeling neglected and eager for revenue, decided to open a new round of bidding for concessions in 1965. This was Hammer's opening, but the odds were stacked against him. Occidental was a minnow swimming with sharks. The Seven Sisters submitted bids that were backed by billions of dollars in assets and decades of technical experience. Hammer knew he couldn't win on merit. He had to win on guile. He launched an intelligence operation. He hired former U.S. ambassadors and CIA contacts to build a dossier on the Libyan royal family. He discovered a critical piece of information. King Idris was not just a monarch. He was the spiritual leader of the Sanusi Muslim sect. He had been born in the remote desert oasis of Kufra, and Kufra, Hammer learned, was dying. The water table was dropping, the date palms were withering, and the king's birthplace was turning into dust. Hammer saw the angle. While the seven sisters were submitting dry, technical proposals about drilling rights and royalty percentages, Hammer submitted a proposal that looked like a biblical miracle. He promised the king that if Occidental won the concession, the company would also undertake a massive hydrological project. They would search for water in Kufra. If they found it, they would build an agricultural paradise, turning the desert green and saving the king's ancestral home. He didn't just pitch an oil deal, he pitched a legacy. To sweeten the pot, Hammer engaged in the kind of direct envelope-passing diplomacy that the Seven Sisters considered beneath them. He allegedly cultivated the king's inner circle with lavish gifts and promises of signing bonuses. The strategy worked. In March 1966, the Libyan government shocked the oil world. They rejected the bids of several major companies and awarded concessions 100, 2 and 103, two vast blocks of desert in the Sirte Basin, to the tiny, unknown Occidental Petroleum. The executives at Exxon and Mobil laughed. They believed Hammer had been swindled. Concessions 102 and 103 were considered garbage acreage. Previous surveys had shown little promise. They believed the communist doctor had paid a fortune for a sandbox. But Hammer wasted no time. He sent drilling crews into the desert immediately. The first few wells were dry, and the laughter in the boardrooms of New York grew louder. But then, in 1967, on Concession 103, the drill bit punched through a layer of reefal limestone and dropped into a cavern. It was a reef field, a geological anomaly where oil is trapped in porous rock under immense pressure. When they tested the well, it didn't just flow, it roared. The well produced 75,000 barrels a day. It was one of the most productive single wells in the history of the oil industry. They had discovered the Intisar field, Arabic for victory. It was a supergiant reservoir holding billions of barrels of high-quality, sweet crude oil that was low in sulfur and cheap to refine. Overnight, Occidental transformed from a minor California gas company into a major international player. Hammer built a 135-mile pipeline across the desert in record time to get the oil to the Mediterranean coast. By 1968, Occidental was shipping nearly 1 million barrels of oil a day out of Libya. The company's stock price increased by over 2,000%. Armand Hammer was suddenly a billionaire, a tycoon who had beaten the Seven Sisters at their own game. But in his triumph, Hammer had created a fatal vulnerability. Unlike Exxon, which sourced oil from dozens of countries, Occidental was now entirely, dangerously dependent on Libya. 90% of the company's crude oil and nearly all of its profit came from the good graces of King Idris. Hammer had built a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, and he was so busy counting his money that he failed to hear the rumble of the tanks that were warming up their engines in the barracks of Tripoli. The morning of September 1st, 1969, marked the beginning of the most precarious and consequential high-wire act in the history of the modern oil industry. In Tripoli, the 27-year-old Captain Muammar Gaddafi had seized the radio stations and declared the end of the monarchy. The streets were filled with tanks and cheering crowds, chanting anti-imperialist slogans. For the executives of the Seven Sisters, The cartel of oil giants like Exxon, Mobil, and BP, the coup was a diplomatic headache, a puzzle to be managed by their friends in the State Department and the British Foreign Office. They had vast, diversified holdings across the globe. If Libya went dark, they could simply turn up the taps in Saudi Arabia or Iran. They viewed the young captain as a temporary nuisance, a hot-headed desert soldier who would eventually realize he needed Western technology to survive. But for Armand Hammer, the coup was an existential threat. Occidental Petroleum was not a diversified giant. It was a one-trick pony. Nearly 90% of the company's crude oil production came from the sands of Libya. The Intisar fields were the beating heart of the corporation. Without them, Occidental was nothing more than a tax shelter with a few dry wells in California. Hammer realized instantly that he was not facing a diplomatic inconvenience. He was facing corporate extinction. While the majors pulled their staff back and waited for the dust to settle, Hammer understood the psychology of the revolutionary. He knew that Gaddafi, unlike the old king, would not be swayed by agricultural projects or polite conversation. Gaddafi wanted two things: money to secure his regime and humiliation for the Western powers that had treated Libya as a colony. The new regime moved with terrifying speed. In early 1970, Gaddafi's government issued an ultimatum to the 21 oil companies operating in the country. He demanded an increase in the posted price of oil, the tax reference price, and, crucially, a hike in the tax rate. For decades, the global standard had been a 50-50 profit split between companies and host governments. It was the sacred text of the oil industry, a line in the sand that the Seven Sisters had sworn never to cross. They believed that if they conceded to Libya, every other petrostate from Venezuela to Iran would demand the same, destroying the profitability of the entire industry. The Seven Sisters, led by Exxon, then Esso, formed a united front. They agreed to stonewall Gaddafi. They believed the young captain would blink. They assumed he needed their tankers and their markets. They treated him with the same condescending arrogance they had shown the king. But Gaddafi was smarter than they gave him credit for. He looked at the map of oil concessions and spotted the weak link. He saw that Exxon could survive a shutdown, but he saw that Occidental Petroleum could not. In May 1970, the Libyan government ordered Occidental to cut its production from 800,000 barrels a day to 500,000. It was a targeted strike. Then they cut it again. They were slowly strangling the company. Hammer watched his stock price plummet. He was legally obligated to deliver oil to his European refineries and customers, but suddenly his taps were running dry. Desperate, Hammer turned to his own countrymen. He approached the chairman of Exxon, Kenneth Jameson, with a plea for solidarity. He asked Exxon to sell him replacement oil at cost, essentially a lifeline to help Occidental fulfill its contracts while they stood united against Gaddafi's demands. It was a test of the industry's united front. Exxon refused. The executives at the Seven Sisters despised Armand Hammer. They viewed him as a briber, a Soviet sympathizer, and a reckless upstart who had stolen their oil in Libya. In a cold, calculated decision, they decided to let him drown. They believed that if Occidental went bankrupt, the problem would be solved and they could likely pick up the Intisar concession for pennies on the dollar. They threw him to the wolves. It was a fatal strategic error. Abandoned by the cartel and facing corporate extinction, Hammer decided to burn the rulebook. He realized that his interests aligned more with the dictator than with the Seven Sisters. He needed oil, Gaddafi needed cash, and a victory against Western imperialism. In September 1970, Armand Hammer flew his private jet, Oxy-1, to Tripoli. He carried with him the full authority to negotiate, bypassing the gridlock that paralyzed the larger companies. He met with Gaddafi's deputy, Major Abdel Salam Jalaud, a hardline nationalist who negotiated with a pistol on his hip. Hammer put a deal on the table that shattered the colonial order of the oil world. He agreed to everything the Libyans wanted. He agreed to raise the posted price of oil by 30 cents a barrel, a massive hike at the time. Even more shockingly, he agreed to increase the tax rate on profits from 50% to 55%. This 5% shift was the shot heard round the world for the global economy. For the first time in history, a Western oil company had formally conceded that a host nation deserved the majority share of the wealth. It broke the psychological barrier of the 50-50 split. In exchange for his capitulation, Gaddafi allowed Occidental to turn the pumps back on to full capacity. Hammer saved his company. He secured the flow of oil that fueled his billions. But the geopolitical cost was astronomical. The dominoes fell instantly. Within weeks of the Hammer-Gaddafi deal, the Shah of Iran, the King of Saudi Arabia, and the government of Venezuela demanded the Libyan terms. The Seven Sisters, their united front broken by Hammer's betrayal, were forced to capitulate across the board. The 50-50 era was dead. The balance of power had shifted permanently from the Western corporations to the producer nations. OPEC had been emboldened. Armand Hammer, in his desperate bid to save Occidental, had inadvertently handed the oil states the weapon they would use to cripple the West in the upcoming 1973 oil embargo. He had saved his company, but he had changed the world. With his Libyan cash flow restored and his reputation as the king of oil cemented, Armand Hammer turned his gaze back to the unfinished business of his youth. He had conquered the capitalist world. Now he wanted to reclaim his position in the communist one. The early 1970s offered a unique geopolitical window. Under President Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, the Cold War was entering the phase of détente, a relaxation of tensions designed to open trade and dialogue. For Hammer, this was not just policy, it was destiny. He saw a chance to be the bridge between Washington and Moscow once again, leveraging his personal history with Lenin to secure deals that no other American CEO could touch. In 1971, Hammer flew to Moscow for the first time since he had fled Stalin's purges in 1930. He carried with him a letter from Lenin, written to him in 1921, which he treated like a holy relic and a diplomatic passport. He requested a meeting with Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party. The Soviet leadership was charmed. To the gray men of the Politburo, Hammer was a living link to the Bolshevik Revolution, a friend of Lenin, who had become a billionaire in the West but never forgot his roots. Brezhnev granted him unprecedented access. He gave Hammer a luxury apartment in Moscow, a VIP pass to bypass customs at Sheremetyevo Airport, and a direct line to the Kremlin. Hammer proposed a deal that was staggering in its scale and complexity, a project he dubbed the fertilizer deal. The Soviet Union was suffering from chronic agricultural failure. Their collective farms were inefficient, and they desperately needed fertilizer to feed their people. Hammer proposed that Occidental Petroleum would build massive chemical plants in the USSR to produce ammonia, a key ingredient in fertilizer. In exchange, the Soviets would ship the ammonia to the United States to be sold by Occidental. To balance the trade, Occidental would mine massive amounts of phosphate in Florida, a resource the Soviets lacked, and ship it to Russia as superphosphoric acid. It was a 20-year barter agreement valued at $20 billion. It was the largest trade deal in the history of U.S.-Soviet relations, a project so vast it required the construction of new ports and fleets of specialized tankers. But to pull it off, Hammer needed more than just Brezhnev's handshake. He needed the United States government. He needed export licenses for the sensitive chemical technology, which the Pentagon feared could be used for weapons. More critically, he needed financing. The Soviets didn't have the cash to pay for the plants up front. Hammer needed the Export-Import Bank, Exim Bank of the United States, to provide massive, low-interest loans to the USSR. He needed the Nixon White House to underwrite his Russian adventure. This need for political access led Hammer into a frantic campaign of lobbying and influence peddling. He donated heavily to Nixon's re-election campaign. He met with Kissinger. He positioned himself as the unofficial ambassador, carrying messages back and forth between the superpowers. Simultaneously, Hammer used his Libyan and Soviet profits to diversify Occidental into a true industrial conglomerate. He didn't just want oil. He wanted to own the entire supply chain of chemicals and minerals. In 1968, he had acquired Hooker Chemical Company, a purchase that seemed astute at the time, but was destined to become a liability of historic proportions. He bought Island Creek Coal, making Occidental a major player in the energy sector. However, his management style remained chaotic and autocratic. He ran Occidental not like a public corporation, but like a private fiefdom. He fired executives on a whim. He used the corporate jet, Oxy 1, to fly his art collection around the world. He forced the company to donate millions to charities that bore his name. He was building a monument to himself, funded by shareholders who were too dazzled by the stock price to ask questions. By 1972, the fertilizer deal was signed. Hammer was at the pinnacle of his power. He was the only man in the world who could call Brezhnev, Gaddafi, and Nixon on the same day. He was hailed on the cover of Time magazine as the capitalist prince of Moscow. But as he celebrated his triumph, the dark undercurrents of his political maneuvering were about to drag him into the greatest scandal of the decade. The Watergate tapes were spinning, and Armand Hammer's name was on them. The unraveling of Armand Hammer's seeming invincibility began not in Tripoli or Moscow, but in a nondescript office in Washington, D.C., amidst the paranoia of Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. By early 1972, the Committee for the Re-election of the President, CREEP, was engaged in a frantic, aggressive shakedown of corporate America. They knew that a new federal law was set to take effect on April 7, 1972, which would require the public disclosure of all campaign donors. Before that date, donations could be anonymous. CREEP operatives fanned out across the country with a simple message for wealthy CEOs: give us cash now secretly or face the wrath of the White House later. For Armand Hammer, this was not a request. It was an extortion demand he could not refuse. He was in the delicate final stages of negotiating the Soviet fertilizer deal. He needed Nixon to overrule the Pentagon on export licenses. He needed the Export-Import Bank to approve the loans. He was vulnerable. On April 3, 1972, just 4 days before the disclosure deadline, Hammer received a call from Tim Babcock, a former governor of Montana and a lobbyist for Occidental. Babcock conveyed the urgency. The White House expected a contribution, and they wanted it in cash. Hammer panicked. He was in Los Angeles. He couldn't write a corporate check, which was illegal. He needed untraceable funds. In a scene that would later be detailed in federal court, Hammer instructed a subordinate to go to a private safe deposit box at a bank in Los Angeles. The aide withdrew $54,000 in $100 bills, money that Hammer had accumulated from various off-the-books ventures for exactly this kind of gray diplomacy. Hammer handed the cash to Babcock. Babcock flew to Washington and delivered the envelope to Maurice Stans, the finance chairman of CREEP. The money was logged as an anonymous donation from 4 fictitious individuals in Montana. It was a classic money laundering operation. At the time, Hammer viewed it as a triumphant stroke of business. Nixon won the election in a landslide. The Soviet deal was signed. Hammer was the king of East-West trade, but he had left a paper trail. When the Watergate scandal broke open in 1973 and 1974, the Special Prosecutor's Office began to dissect the finances of the Nixon campaign. They found the Montana donations. They squeezed Tim Babcock. Facing prison time, Babcock flipped. He told the prosecutors the truth. The money came from Armand Hammer. In 1975, the Department of Justice indicted Armand Hammer on federal charges of making illegal campaign contributions and obstruction of justice. For the first time in his life, Hammer was facing a situation he could not bribe his way out of. He was 77 years old. A prison sentence, even a short one, would destroy his reputation, collapse his control over Occidental's board, and likely end his life. He was terrified. But Armand Hammer was a survivor. He decided to fight the charges not with facts he was clearly guilty, but with biology. He checked himself into a hospital in Los Angeles. He hired a team of expensive cardiologists who produced a flurry of medical reports. They claimed that Hammer was suffering from a litany of fatal conditions: severe arrhythmia, congestive heart failure, and advanced atherosclerosis. They argued that the stress of a trial, let alone prison, would kill him instantly. The prosecutors were skeptical. They pointed out that dying Armand Hammer had just flown around the world 3 times in his private jet to close deals. But the medical evidence, however curated, was enough to create doubt. In October 1975, the final act of the drama played out in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles. It was a masterclass in theater. Armand Hammer did not walk into court. He was wheeled in. He sat in a wheelchair, hooked up to portable heart monitoring equipment, with a doctor and a nurse hovering over him, checking his vitals every few minutes. He looked pale, frail, and pathetic, a grandfather on death's door. The judge, Lawrence Liddick, looked at the defendant and blinked. He could not bring himself to be the man who killed a philanthropist in open court. Hammer pleaded guilty to 3 misdemeanor counts. The judge sentenced him to 1 year of probation and a $3,000 fine. It was a total victory. As soon as the gavel banged, the dying man underwent a miraculous recovery. He was wheeled out of the courthouse, helped into his limousine, and reportedly ordered his driver to take him straight to the airport. Within days, he was back in the boardroom of Occidental Petroleum, barking orders and planning his next trip to Moscow. He had successfully used his own body as a prop to defeat the United States government. By the end of 1975, Armand Hammer seemed invincible. He had survived the Bolsheviks, he had survived the Libyan Revolution, and he had survived Watergate. He was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar energy giant. He was a friend of presidents and premiers, but the seeds of his next and greatest crisis were already planted. Deep in the files of Hooker Chemical, the company he had bought in 1968 with his Libyan profits, lay a secret that no amount of acting could cover up. While Hammer was dodging prison in Los Angeles, a chemical soup was rising to the surface of a schoolyard in Niagara Falls, New York. The era of the accidental oil man was ending. The era of the toxic empire was about to begin. Can money wash away the sins of Piper Alpha? By 1976, Armand Hammer had successfully navigated the minefields of Watergate and the Libyan coup. He had pleaded guilty to a federal crime but avoided prison, using his health as a theatrical shield. He had lost his monopoly in Libya, but gained a fortune in the process. At the age of 78, most men would have retreated to a quiet retirement, content to count their millions. But Hammer was driven by a pathological need for expansion and public adulation. He wanted Occidental Petroleum to be the largest energy company in the world, and he wanted to be recognized as a global statesman, a peer to presidents and kings. However, the next decade of his life would not be defined solely by his diplomatic triumphs, but by the horrific consequences of his corporate negligence. The empire he had built on oil and chemicals was about to poison the earth and burn the sea. The first catastrophe had been ticking silently underground for decades, buried in the soil of a quiet, working-class neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York. In the heady days of his Libyan expansion in the late 1960s, Hammer had gone on a buying spree. Flush with petrodollars, he had acquired Hooker Chemical Company in 1968. It was a strategic acquisition designed to diversify Occidental beyond the volatile oil markets. Hammer looked at the balance sheets and saw a profitable industrial manufacturer. He did not look closely at the land deeds. If he had, he might have noticed a peculiar transaction from 1953 where Hooker Chemical had sold a 16-acre landfill to the local school board for the token sum of $1. That landfill was known as Love Canal. Between 1942 and 1953, Hooker Chemical had used the abandoned canal project as a dumping ground for its most toxic industrial byproducts. They had buried 21,000 tons of chemical waste, a witch's brew of carcinogens, including benzene, dioxin, and PCBs, in metal drums, covered them with clay, and then sold the land. The deed contained a clause that supposedly absolved the company of any future liability, a legal firewall that the company believed would protect it forever. Over the next 20 years, a suburban neighborhood was built directly on top of this chemical grave. An elementary school was constructed in the center. Children played on the playground, unaware that beneath their feet, the metal drums were rusting and rotting. In 1976, the year after Hammer's Watergate conviction, the rains in New York were unusually heavy. The water table rose, and the chemicals began to surface. It started with a smell, a sweet, cloying chemical stench that hung over the neighborhood like a shroud. Then, strange substances began to ooze into basements. Trees turned black and died. Puddles in backyards shimmered with unnatural, iridescent colors. Children came home from the playground with chemical burns on their hands and faces. Rocks would spontaneously ignite when thrown against a sidewalk. But the physical signs were nothing compared to the biological horror that was unfolding. A local housewife named Lois Gibbs began to investigate after her son developed epilepsy and a low white blood cell count. She went door to door, mapping the health of her neighbors. What she found was a cluster of tragedy that defied statistical probability. There were astronomical rates of miscarriage. Babies were being born with cleft palates, extra rows of teeth, and mental disabilities. In one terrifying sequence of houses, nearly every woman had suffered a stillbirth or a birth defect. The residents were living on top of a poisonous sponge. By 1978, Love Canal had become a national media sensation. It was the first televised environmental disaster in American history. Reporters flocked to Niagara Falls, filming the black sludge oozing through basement walls. Lois Gibbs and her neighbors held 2 EPA officials hostage in a house to demand action. The crisis forced President Jimmy Carter to intervene. On August 7, 1978, President Carter declared a federal health emergency at Love Canal, the first time such an order had ever been issued for a man-made disaster. He ordered the evacuation of the families living closest to the canal. Eventually, over 900 families would be relocated and the neighborhood would be bulldozed, leaving behind a ghost town fenced off by barbed wire. For Armand Hammer and Occidental Petroleum, Love Canal was a public relations nightmare and a massive legal liability. Technically, the dumping had happened before Occidental bought the company. But in the eyes of the law, and certainly in the eyes of the public, Occidental now owned the mess. Hammer's reaction was characteristic. He attacked. He did not apologize. He did not offer immediate compensation. Instead, Occidental's legal team launched a ferocious defense. They argued that Hooker Chemical had been a responsible corporate citizen, that they had warned the school board about the waste in 1953, and that the construction of the school and sewers had punctured the clay seal, releasing the chemicals. They blamed the victims and the local government. Hammer refused to visit the site. He viewed the residents not as victims, but as opportunists looking for a payout. While the mothers of Love Canal were weeping on the evening news, Hammer was in Los Angeles or Moscow, finalizing deals and collecting art. He insulated himself completely from the human misery his subsidiary had caused. However, he could not insulate the company from the consequences. The Love Canal disaster was the catalyst for a fundamental change in American law. It led directly to the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, better known as the Superfund Act. This law created a tax on chemical and petroleum industries to clean up toxic sites. It established the principle that the polluter pays regardless of when the dumping occurred. Occidental Petroleum would spend decades in court fighting the Love Canal liability. In the end, they would be forced to pay $129 million in restitution to the federal government and $98 million to the state of New York, along with millions more to individual victims. But in the late 1970s, Hammer was adamant, not a cent for the people of Niagara Falls. He treated the poisoning of an American town as a bothersome litigation issue, a line item on a balance sheet to be managed by lawyers. As the 1970s closed, Hammer's reputation was split. To the business world, he was a genius who had survived Libya. To the environmental movement, he was a villain who presided over the poisoning of children. But Hammer didn't care about the opinions of housewives in New York. He cared about the opinions of history. He was entering his 80s, and he could feel time slipping away. He needed a legacy that would overshadow the scandals. He needed a prize that money couldn't buy, but which he was determined to purchase anyway, the Nobel Peace Prize. As the 1980s dawned, Armand Hammer entered his 9th decade of life with a vitality that seemed almost supernatural. While Occidental lawyers battled the victims of Love Canal in court, Hammer embarked on a frantic global campaign to rewrite his own biography. He knew that his obituary, as it stood, would be dominated by Watergate, illegal campaign contributions, and toxic waste. This was unacceptable to a man with an ego the size of the oil fields he drilled. He decided that if he could not erase his past, he would simply outspend it. He launched what can only be described as checkbook diplomacy on a planetary scale, with a singular, obsessive goal to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Hammer's strategy was to position himself not as an oil tycoon, but as a Renaissance man, a patron of the arts and a global peacemaker who operated above the fray of the Cold War. In December 1980, he made a purchase that stunned the cultural world. The Earl of Leicester, in need of cash, put a rare manuscript up for auction, the Codex Leicester, a 72-page notebook of scientific writings and sketches by Leonardo da Vinci. It was one of the most precious documents in human history. Museums around the world scrambled to buy it, but they could not compete with the petrodollars of Occidental Petroleum. Hammer bought the manuscript for $5.12 million, the highest price ever paid for a manuscript at that time. But he did not donate it to a museum or keep it in the Lester family name. In an act of supreme narcissism, he renamed it the Codex Hammer. He erased Leonardo's patron and inserted himself. He had the manuscript broken apart and framed so he could tour it around the world, basking in the reflected glory of Da Vinci's genius. He was signaling to the world that he was not a polluter. He was the custodian of civilization. This art-washing strategy extended to the highest levels of the British aristocracy. Hammer identified Prince Charles, the heir to the British throne, as a key strategic asset. He knew the prince was perpetually short of funds for his various charities and architectural projects. Hammer became the prince's fairy godfather. He poured millions into the prince's causes, becoming one of the largest individual donors to the British royal family. In exchange, he received the legitimacy he craved. He was photographed with the Queen. He was made an honorary knight. The Bolshevik from the Bronx was now hobnobbing with the Windsors, using shareholder money to buy entry into the most exclusive club on earth. However, his most delicate high-wire act was in Washington. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidency. Reagan was a hardline anti-communist who had famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire. For Hammer, whose entire career was built on his friendship with the Kremlin, this should have been a disaster. The FBI file on Hammer was thick with allegations of Soviet espionage, but Hammer possessed a chameleon-like ability to adapt. He managed to convince the Reagan administration that his Soviet connections were an asset, not a liability. He positioned himself as the ultimate back channel, the only man who could talk to the geriatric leaders in Moscow when official diplomatic lines were frozen. The early 1980s were a time of transition in the Kremlin. Leonid Brezhnev died in 1982, Yuri Andropov died in 1984, Konstantin Chernenko died in 1985. Hammer attended every funeral. He flew Oxy 1 into Moscow, met with the new leaders, and then flew back to Washington to brief the White House. He carried messages, facilitated grain deals, and brokered cultural exchanges. He made himself indispensable. Reagan, despite his ideological rigidity, was pragmatic enough to use Hammer. In a remarkable turnaround, the man the FBI suspected of being a KGB asset was appointed by Reagan to serve on the president's cancer panel. Hammer seized on this appointment with his usual grandiose flair. He announced to the world that he would personally fund the cure for cancer. He promised, with zero scientific basis, that a cure would be found by his 90th birthday. He forced Occidental to pour millions into cancer research, demanding impossible timelines from scientists. It was another facet of his legacy building. He wanted to be remembered not just as a peacemaker, but as a healer, the doctor who saved humanity from its deadliest disease. Yet, behind the glitz of the galas and the diplomatic shuttles, the toxic empire was expanding its footprint. Occidental Petroleum was growing aggressively, often by cutting corners on safety to maximize profit. The company had moved heavily into the North Sea, acquiring oil platforms in the rough, dangerous waters off the coast of Scotland. In the boardroom, Hammer's autocracy was becoming erratic. He was in his mid-80s, but he refused to groom a successor. He fired executives who showed too much competence or independence. He treated the company's treasury as his personal piggy bank, using corporate funds to pay for his biographies, his travel, and his vanity projects. His own family was not spared. His son, Julius Hammer, was kept on a short leash, dependent on an allowance and marginalized from the business. His granddaughter, Casey Hammer, watched as her grandfather spent what should have been her inheritance on buying medals and honorary degrees for himself. The family was terrified of him. He controlled them with money and fear, threatening to cut them off if they stepped out of line. He was creating a hollowed-out dynasty, rich in assets but bankrupt in trust. By 1985, Armand Hammer seemed to have achieved the impossible. He had survived the stigma of Love Canal. He had charmed the Reagan White House. He owned Da Vinci's notebook. He was effectively the shadow Secretary of State for U.S.-Soviet relations. But physics and probability were catching up with his empire. In his relentless drive for profit, to fund his global lifestyle, he had pushed his industrial assets to the breaking point. In the frozen plains of Ukraine and the cold waters of the North Sea, two catastrophes were waiting to happen. One would involve a nuclear reactor, and the other would involve an oil rig. Both would expose the hollowness of Hammer's promises, and one would result in the deadliest offshore oil disaster in the history of the world. The peacemaker was about to be confronted with a level of violence and destruction that no amount of checkbook diplomacy could fix. The year 1986 offered Armand Hammer precisely the kind of geopolitical catastrophe he thrived upon. In April, the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, releasing a plume of radioactive material that terrified the world. While Western governments scrambled to assess the fallout, Hammer saw an opportunity for the ultimate public relations coup. He immediately picked up the phone and called the Kremlin. He didn't just offer condolences, he offered a solution. Using his personal fortune and his role as the chairman of the president's cancer panel, he dispatched a team of elite American bone marrow specialists, led by Dr. Robert Gale, to Moscow to treat the radiation victims. It was a masterstroke of medical diplomacy. At the height of the Cold War, with tensions still simmering, an American capitalist was saving Soviet lives. The new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, was deeply grateful. He granted Hammer unprecedented access, effectively treating him as a visiting head of state. Hammer used this goodwill to secure new chemical contracts for Occidental and to position himself as the primary intermediary for the coming arms control talks between Reagan and Gorbachev. He was 88 years old, and he was arguably the most influential private citizen on Earth. The doctor had healed the rift between East and West, or so his press releases claimed. But while Hammer was playing the savior in Moscow, his own industrial empire in the North Sea was rotting from neglect. Occidental Petroleum had entered the British North Sea oil boom in the early 1970s, acquiring the Piper oil field. At the center of this field stood Piper Alpha, a monstrous offshore platform located 120 miles off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland. It was the crown jewel of Occidental's European operations. By 1988, Piper Alpha was a colossal money-printing machine, pumping over 300,000 barrels of crude oil a day, roughly 10% of the entire United Kingdom's oil production. However, the platform was a death trap in the waiting. Originally built in 1976 to drill for oil, it had been retrofitted in the early 1980s to also process natural gas. This modification packed high-pressure gas processing equipment into a dangerously confined space right next to the crew's sleeping quarters and the control room. Safety experts had warned that the design was flawed, that the firewalls were insufficient to withstand a gas explosion. But the culture at Occidental, driven from the top down by Hammer, was one of aggressive cost containment and maximum production. Safety upgrades were viewed as expenses to be minimized. In 1987, the price of oil had collapsed, squeezing profit margins. The directive from Los Angeles was clear: keep the oil flowing at all costs. Maintenance was often deferred or conducted while the platform remained live and pumping, a dangerous practice known as simultaneous operations. On the night of July 6, 1988, that philosophy of profit over safety collided with the laws of physics. At approximately 9:55 p.m., a condensate pump on the platform's lower deck tripped. The night crew, attempting to restart operations unaware that a critical safety valve had been removed for maintenance by the day shift, activated a backup pump. The missing valve had been replaced by a blind flange, a flat metal disc, which was not hand-tightened sufficiently to withstand the immense pressure. Gas leaked out. It found an ignition source, and then hell opened up in the middle of the North Sea. The initial explosion ripped through the B module of the platform. It was violent, but it was theoretically survivable. However, the blast destroyed the firewall, separating the gas processing unit from the oil storage. A massive oil fire erupted, sending a column of thick, choking black smoke up into the accommodation block, where hundreds of men were off shift, sleeping or relaxing in the cinema. The control room, the nerve center of the platform, was destroyed instantly. The rig manager was killed. The emergency shutdown systems failed. The crew was leaderless, trapped in the dark, choking on smoke with no alarms sounding and no instructions. But the true horror of Piper Alpha was not the initial fire. It was the escalation. Piper Alpha was not an island. It was the hub of a network. It was connected by massive underwater pipelines to two other platforms, Tartan and Claymore, operated by Texaco and Occidental, respectively. These pipelines were pressurized with gas and oil. When the fire started on Piper Alpha, the managers on the Tartan and Claymore platforms saw the flames on the horizon. Logic and safety protocols dictated that they should immediately shut down their pumps to stop feeding fuel to the fire. But they didn't. They hesitated. They were terrified of the cost. Shutting down the pipeline would mean stopping production across the entire field, costing millions of dollars an hour. They didn't have the authority to make that call. They tried to radio their headquarters on shore for permission, but the lines were jammed or the executives were unreachable. So they kept pumping. For over an hour, the Tartan and Claymore platforms continued to pump oil and gas directly into the inferno on Piper Alpha. The fire, fed by this pressurized fuel, grew to an unimaginable intensity. It melted the steel structure of the rig. The helideck, where men were waiting for rescue, collapsed into the sea. The accommodation block, filled with trapped workers, slid into the boiling ocean. It was a man-made volcano, fueled by corporate indecision. By the time the pipelines were finally shut off, it was too late. Of the 226 men on board Piper Alpha that night, 165 died. 2 rescuers also perished, bringing the death toll to 167. Most did not die from the flames. They died from smoke inhalation, huddled together in the galley, waiting for a rescue order that never came because the men authorized to give it were dead, and the executives authorized to stop the flow of oil or asleep in their beds. When the news broke the next morning, it was the deadliest offshore oil disaster in the history of the industry. The images of the burning platform shocked the world. Armand Hammer's reaction to the tragedy was chillingly consistent with his character. When Chernobyl exploded, he had rushed to the scene with doctors and aid, eager for the cameras. When Piper Alpha exploded, a disaster caused by his own company, he did not fly to Scotland immediately. He remained in Los Angeles. He sent lawyers and insurance adjusters. He He viewed Piper Alpha not as a human tragedy, but as a liability issue. His primary concern was the stock price and the legal exposure. Occidental's legal strategy was aggressive. They sought to settle claims quickly to avoid a drawn-out public inquiry that would expose the systemic safety failures. However, they could not stop the Cullen inquiry, a British government investigation launched in late 1988. The inquiry would take 2 years, but its preliminary findings were devastating. It peeled back the layers of the toxic empire. It showed that Occidental had prioritized production over safety at every turn. It revealed that the safety valve had been removed and the permit to do so had been lost in a chaotic paper trail. It revealed that the firewalls were inadequate. It revealed a culture of fear where workers were afraid to report safety violations. By the end of 1988, Armand Hammer was 90 years old. He was celebrating his birthday with a gala attended by celebrities and politicians, basking in adulation. But the smoke from Piper Alpha hung over the party like a shroud. As the lawsuits mounted, Hammer turned his back on the burning oil platforms to fight one last war, not against nature, but against his own shareholders and his own wife, stealing a wife's fortune to build a tombstone for himself. As the year 1989 dawned, the sun was beginning to set on the American century. But inside the hermetically sealed world of Occidental Petroleum, the cult of personality surrounding Armand Hammer was reaching a fever pitch of delusion and excess. At 90 years old, Hammer was physically frail, his body kept alive by a daily regimen of swimming, blood transfusions, and experimental treatments, yet his appetite for self-aggrandizement remained insatiable. He had spent decades buying politicians and dictators. Now, in his final act, he was attempting to buy immortality. However, the year 1989 would not be defined by his triumphs, but by the opening salvos of a legal and familial war that would expose the moral void at the center of his empire. The conflict began with a building. For years, Hammer had promised to leave his vast art collection, valued, or so he claimed, at over $400 million, to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA. It was to be his legacy to the city. But Hammer's ego could not abide sharing billing. When LACMA refused to rename their entire institution after him or grant him total curatorial control over how his paintings were displayed, Hammer reneged on the deal. He decided that if he could not dominate an existing museum, he would build his own. He announced plans for the Armand Hammer Museum of Art and Cultural Center, a marble monolith to be constructed adjacent to the Occidental Petroleum headquarters in Westwood, Los Angeles. The problem was the funding. Hammer did not intend to pay for it himself. He demanded that the public shareholders of Occidental Petroleum foot the bill. In early 1989, Hammer forced the board of directors, a group of men he had handpicked for their pliability, to approve an expenditure that was breathtaking in its audacity. Occidental would pay $86 million to construct the building. Furthermore, the corporation would pay roughly $50 million to purchase the art collection from Hammer personally or from his charitable foundation so it could be housed in the museum. In essence, Hammer was forcing the company he ran to buy his own possessions at an inflated price and then build a shrine to hold them, all while he retained total control. This decision triggered a shareholder revolt that shattered the boardroom's code of silence. Alan Kahn, a tenacious corporate litigant representing the California State Teachers Retirement System and other institutional investors, filed a derivative lawsuit, Sullivan v. Hammer. The lawsuit accused Hammer of treating a Fortune 500 company as his private playground. The legal discovery process in 1989 was a disaster for Hammer's reputation. Depositions revealed that the independent committee set up to review the museum project was a sham, staffed by Hammer's cronies. Documents showed that the construction costs were spiraling out of control, eventually topping $100 million for a museum that critics argued was unnecessary and located in a commercial office district. For the first time, Hammer's invincibility was punctured. To settle the lawsuit in October 1989, the company was forced to impose a cap on construction costs, which Hammer would largely ignore, and, more significantly, to place strict limits on future charitable contributions to Hammer's personal causes. It was a public humiliation, a legal acknowledgement that the CEO was looting the company for his vanity. But while Hammer was fighting his shareholders in the boardroom, he was waging a far darker, more intimate war in his own bedroom. His wife, Frances Hammer, was the financial bedrock of his life. A wealthy widow when he married her in 1956, it was her fortune that had provided the seed capital for his initial investment in Occidental. For 30 years she had stood by his side, tolerating his travel, his ego, and his parade of mistresses. But by 1989, Frances was 87 years old, frail and bedridden. She was dying. Armand Hammer saw her impending death not as a tragedy, but as a financial crisis. Frances had a will. In it, she had left a significant portion of her massive personal estate, worth tens of millions of dollars, to her own family, specifically her niece Joan Weiss. She intended for her money to return to her bloodline, not to be swallowed by the Hammer ambition. Hammer could not allow this. He needed her money. He needed it to pay off the debts he had secretly accrued buying art and funding his globetrotting diplomacy. He needed it to secure the endowment for his museum. Throughout the spring and summer of 1989, while Frances lay in a medicated haze in their Westwood penthouse, Armand orchestrated what his own family would later describe as grand larceny. He isolated her. He fired her longtime lawyers and accountants, replacing them with his own loyalists. He restricted access to her niece, Joan Weiss. Then he produced a series of documents. These were waivers and community property agreements. The documents effectively transferred ownership of Frances's separate property, her stocks, her bonds, her art, into joint accounts controlled by Armand. The signing of these documents remains one of the most contentious moments in the family history. Frances was heavily medicated, suffering from a broken hip and cognitive decline. Witnesses later testified that Armand would go into her bedroom with a stack of papers, badgering her until she signed, telling her they were routine business. In one particularly egregious instance, detailed in court filings, Hammer convinced her to sign a document waiving her rights to their joint art collection, a collection that had been largely purchased with her money, so that he could donate it to his museum. Frances Hammer died on December 16, 1989. She died thinking her estate was secure for her niece. She did not know that she was dying almost penniless. Armand had systematically drained her accounts. Within days of her funeral, the truth began to emerge. When Joan Weiss attempted to probate the will, she found the cupboards were bare. The millions were gone, transferred into the Armand Hammer Foundation or Hammer's personal accounts. The death of Frances removed the last human restraint on Armand Hammer. He was now a widower, 91 years old, and in sole possession of a stolen fortune. But he was also a man running out of time, and he knew it. The year 1989 ended with Hammer alone in his penthouse, surrounded by lawyers and sycophants plotting his final year on earth. He had won the money, but he had guaranteed a posthumous war. Joan Weiss was not going to walk away. She hired a team of aggressive litigators and prepared to sue Armand Hammer for fraud elder abuse, and theft. The stage was set for a legal autopsy that would rip the Hammer legend apart, piece by piece. As the year 1990 began, Armand Hammer entered the final frantic 12 months of his life. He was 91 years old, a man physically decaying but fueled by a terrifying, almost maniacal energy. To the outside world, watching him on CNN or reading his press releases, he remained the globe-trotting billionaire, the citizen diplomat who was negotiating peace in the Middle East and promising to cure cancer. But inside the sealed environment of his private jet, Oxy 1, and his penthouse in Los Angeles, the reality was a grotesque tragicomedy of desperation, fraud, and cruelty. The emperor was not just naked, he was skinning his own family to keep himself warm. The driving force of his final year was a singular, consuming obsession that had haunted him for decades, but had now reached a fever pitch: the Nobel Peace Prize. Hammer did not just want the prize, he believed he had bought it. For years, he had engaged in a campaign of bribery and influence peddling directed at the Nobel Committee in Oslo that was breathtaking in its crudity. He had commissioned hagiographic biographies of himself, printed in multiple languages and shipped by the crate to Sweden. He had flown committee members and European dignitaries on all expenses-paid trips to Los Angeles and London, wining and dining them with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He had even allegedly nominated himself, using his vast network of political dependents, senators, princes, and prime ministers, to send letters of recommendation that he had often drafted himself. In early 1990, believing the prize was finally within his grasp for his work on U.S.-Soviet relations and the Chernobyl airlift, Hammer prepared his acceptance speech. He ordered his staff to prepare for the trip to Oslo in December. But as the months wore on, whispers from diplomatic circles suggested that the committee was not as purchasable as a Libyan oil concession. They saw through the charade. They knew about the Watergate conviction. They knew about the Soviet ties. Hammer's reaction to the silence from Oslo was a rage that terrified his subordinates. He doubled down. He began to throw money at any peace initiative he could find, hoping to buy his way back into contention before he died. He pledged hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Carter Center, trying to piggyback on the genuine reputation of former President Jimmy Carter. Despite his failing health, he embarked on a grueling tour of the Middle East. He flew to Israel to meet with Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, then to Cairo to meet with President Hosni Mubarak, inserting himself into sensitive negotiations where he had no official standing. He made wild promises of investment and aid, commitments that Occidental Petroleum would later have to disavow. It was a diplomat's nightmare, a senile billionaire with a private air force careening around the world's hotspots, making promises the U.S. government couldn't keep, all to win a medal. While Hammer was chasing glory abroad, his behavior toward his own family at home descended into a level of malice that bordered on the sociopathic. With his wife Frances dead and her fortune successfully, if fraudulently, absorbed into his accounts, Hammer turned his sights on his only son, Julian Hammer. Julian was 61 years old, a man broken by a lifetime of his father's neglect and bullying. He lived in a modest house dependent on a monthly allowance from Armand, struggling with his own demons. He had always been a disappointment to Armand. He wasn't a ruthless businessman. He was a troubled soul. But in 1990, he became something more dangerous to Armand. He became a threat. Armand was terrified that after his death, Julian would try to claim a share of the estate. Under California law, a son could challenge a will, especially one that left him nothing. Furthermore, Julian knew secrets. He knew about the Soviet money. He knew about the mistresses. If Julian spoke to the press or to Joan Weiss's lawyers, he could destroy the museum project. So, on his 92nd birthday in May 1990, Armand Hammer decided to give his son a special gift. He tried to frame him. According to later accounts by Casey Hammer, Julian's daughter, and investigations by biographer Edward J. Epstein, Armand tasked his head of security with finding dirt on Julian that could be used to blackmail him into waiving his inheritance rights. When they couldn't find enough dirt, they manufactured it. There were allegations of planted evidence, solicitation entrapments, and attempts to get Julian arrested on felony charges. It was a Shakespearean level of betrayal. A 92-year-old father sitting on a fortune of stolen money, trying to send his 61-year-old son to prison to protect a museum that hadn't even been built yet. The plot failed to result in a long prison sentence, but it succeeded in terrorizing Julian. He retreated further into silence exactly as his father intended. As the summer of 1990 turned to autumn, Hammer's body began to shut down. He was suffering from severe anemia and bone marrow failure, a condition likely exacerbated by his frantic lifestyle. He required daily blood transfusions. He traveled with a mobile hospital unit and a team of doctors who were on the payroll to keep him upright, yet he refused to stop. In a bizarre attempt to settle his spiritual accounts, or perhaps just to generate another photo op, Hammer decided to have a bar mitzvah. He had never had the ceremony as a child in the Bronx because his father Julius was a staunch atheist communist. In late 1990, at age 92, he stood in a synagogue, wrapped in a prayer shawl, chanting Hebrew. To his supporters, it was a moving return to faith. To his critics, it was one last deal, this time with God, trying to negotiate favorable terms for the afterlife. The final months were a macabre spectacle. He was a dying king surrounded by courtiers who were terrified of him, but also waiting for him to die. His top executives at Occidental, led by Ray Arani, the man Hammer had groomed as a successor but also frequently threatened and humiliated, were quietly preparing for the post-Hammer era. They knew the company's balance sheet was a disaster. Occidental was weighed down by billions in debt from Hammer's bad investments in coal mines, cattle farms, and film production studios. They were sharpening their knives, waiting for the heart monitor to flatline. In November 1990, the Armand Hammer Museum of Art and Cultural Center finally opened in Westwood, Los Angeles. It was a black tie affair, attended by the elite of Hollywood and Washington. Hammer arrived in a wheelchair, his skin papery and translucent, looking like a wax figure of himself. He cut the ribbon on the building that had cost his shareholders over $100 million, and his family their inheritance. He smiled for the cameras, basking in the adulation one last time. He didn't look at the art, he looked at his name carved in giant letters above the door. He had done it. He had built his pyramid. It was his tombstone, and he was there to see it. 2 weeks later, on December 10th, 1990, the inevitable happened. Armand Hammer died in his sleep at his home in Los Angeles. The Nobel Prize he so desperately wanted had been awarded to Mikhail Gorbachev 2 months earlier. Hammer died unmedaled. The official statement from Occidental Petroleum mourned the loss of a giant of the 20th century, a peacemaker, and a philanthropist. The obituaries in the New York Times and the Washington Post were respectful, listing his achievements, his friendship with Lenin, and his oil empire. The President of the United States sent condolences, but the silence lasted less than 24 hours. The moment Armand Hammer stopped breathing, the spell broke, the fear evaporated, and the scavengers moved in. The day after the funeral, the emperor's new clothes were stripped away, revealing the rotting corpse of a fraud that had lasted for 70 years. On the morning of December 11th, 1990, less than 24 hours after Armand Hammer took his last breath, the board of directors of Occidental Petroleum convened in Los Angeles. For 30 years, these men had functioned as Hammer's personal chorus, approving his whims, laughing at his jokes, and authorizing the use of shareholder funds for his vanity projects. But with the tyrant dead, the fear evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold corporate ruthlessness. Ray Armie, the man Hammer had nominally groomed as a successor but frequently humiliated and threatened to fire, seized the gavel. He didn't deliver a eulogy, he ordered a purge. Armie initiated a program of dehammerization that was Soviet in its speed and thoroughness. The goal was to excise the cancer of Hammer's ego from the company's balance sheet. The board voted immediately to cancel the unauthorized autobiography Hammer had commissioned. They fired the staff of the Armand Hammer Foundation, who had been on the corporate payroll. They ordered the liquidation of Armand Hammer Productions, the film's subsidiary that had produced hagiographic documentaries about the chairman's life. But the most symbolic act of the purge concerned the physical trappings of Hammer's power. For decades, Hammer had treated Occidental not as an energy company, but as a conglomerate of his personal hobbies. He had used corporate funds to build one of the world's largest stables of Arabian horses, a business that lost money but gained him entry into royal circles. Armie ordered the horses sold. He ordered the sale of Oxy 1, the Boeing 727 that had served as Hammer's flying palace, costing the company millions annually in fuel and crew to shuttle Hammer to art openings and galas. Most controversially, Armie moved to sever the company's lifeline to the Armand Hammer Museum. The building in Westwood, which had opened only weeks earlier, was suddenly an orphan. It had been built on the promise of endless corporate support, but Armie cut the cord. Occidental agreed to pay a final, lump sum settlement to divorce itself from the museum entirely. The marble mausoleum, intended to be Hammer's eternal monument, was left teetering on the brink of insolvency, a vanity project with no patron. While the corporate executives were dismantling his business legacy, the lawyers were dissecting his personal life. The reading of Armand Hammer's will was expected to be the unveiling of a pharaoh's treasure. The world believed he was a multi-billionaire. His family believed there was a fortune to be divided. But when the executors opened the books in early 1991, they found a financial mirage. The billionaire had died with an estate valued at roughly $40 million, and almost every cent of it was claimed by creditors. The Internal Revenue Service had liens against him for millions in back taxes. The banks held mortgages on his properties. He had been living on a mountain of debt, using the company's expense accounts to fund a lifestyle he could not personally afford. The emperor was not only naked, he was bankrupt. To the family he left behind, this was the final devastating betrayal. Julius Hammer, his only son, received a small trust that was barely enough to cover his own debts. Casey Hammer, his granddaughter, received a token amount. The vast fortune they had been promised, the birthright for which they had endured decades of manipulation, surveillance, and emotional abuse, did not exist. It had been spent on bribes, lawyers, and the purchase of metals. As the shock of the insolvency set in, the silence of Hammer's inner circle broke. In 1991 and 1992, a wave of lawsuits filed by the women in Hammer's life turned his posthumous reputation into a tabloid spectacle. The first bombshell came from Martha Kaufman. For decades, she had been known in Los Angeles society as a curator and art consultant. In her lawsuit, she revealed the truth. She had been Hammer's mistress for nearly 40 years. She alleged that Hammer had promised to take care of her in his will, a promise he had broken. But Kaufman's lawsuit was dangerous, not because of the money she demanded, but because of the secrets she possessed. She detailed how Hammer had used her name to hide assets from his wife, Frances. She revealed the existence of secret slush funds and art caches that had been kept off the books of both Occidental and the IRS. Close on the heels of the Kaufman suit came an even more damaging confession from Hillary Gibson. To the public, Gibson was the poised, professional director of the Armand Hammer Museum. In 1991, she revealed her true identity. She was Hammer's longtime lover, who had literally changed her name and appearance, wearing wigs and disguises, at his behest to avoid the scrutiny of his wife. Gibson's testimony destroyed the last shred of Hammer's reputation as an art connoisseur. She admitted to investigators and journalists that she had helped Hammer forge the provenance of paintings. She described a system of art laundering, where Hammer would use shareholder money to buy second-rate paintings, hang them in his private homes, and then donate them to his own museum at vastly inflated valuations to claim massive tax deductions. She revealed that the masterpieces in the collection were often of dubious authenticity, purchased not for their beauty but for their utility as tax shelters. The cultural diplomat was revealed to be running a tax evasion scheme disguised as a gallery. Simultaneously, the legal battle over Frances Hammer's estate exploded into a full-blown war. Joan Weiss, Frances's niece, launched a ferocious legal campaign to prove that Armand had defrauded his wife of millions. Weiss's lawyers utilized the new testimony from the mistresses to build a case of massive elder abuse. They argued that in the final years of Frances's life, while she was frail and medicated, Armand had tricked her into signing waivers that transferred her immense wealth directly into his own accounts to pay off his gambling debts and fund his secret operations. The Weiss lawsuit became a public autopsy of the Hammer marriage. It revealed that Armand had bugged his wife's bedroom. It showed that he had fired her loyal staff and replaced them with his own spies. It painted a picture of a sociopath who had spent his evenings gaslighting his dying wife to steal her inheritance. By 1992, the demolition was total. Armand Hammer, the man who had charmed Lenin and Reagan, was legally and publicly branded a fraud, a thief, and a bully. His company had disowned him. His museum was suing his estate. His family was destitute. But the final blow would not come from a California courtroom. It would come from the other side of the world. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, and in the chaos of the new Russian Federation, the archives of the KGB and the Comintern were briefly, miraculously, cracked open to Western researchers. Historians and intelligence analysts rushed into the breach, looking for the truth about the Cold War. And there, in the dusty files of the Lubyanka and the Central Committee, they found the name that appeared again and again from the 1920s to the 1980s, the capitalist. The secrets that Armand Hammer had spent 70 years protecting, the truth about the pencil factory, the Romanov treasures, and the messages he carried between the superpowers were sitting in cardboard boxes in Moscow, waiting to be read. By 1992, the legal and financial dismantling of Armand Hammer's estate in Los Angeles was largely complete. The emperor had been stripped of his clothes, revealed as a bankrupt fraud. But while the lawyers in California were fighting over the scraps of his debt, a far more significant historical reckoning was beginning to unfold thousands of miles away in Moscow. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 had created a chaotic vacuum in the Russian capital, and for the first time in 70 years, the iron doors of the state intelligence archives were left unguarded. In 1992 and 1993, a new breed of investigator began to arrive in Moscow. These were not businessmen seeking oil deals. They were historians and journalists seeking the truth. Among them was Edward J. Epstein, the biographer who had been tracking Hammer's contradictions for years. He gained access to the files of the Comintern, Communist International, and the Central Committee, archives that had been sealed since the days of Lenin. What these investigators found in the dusty boxes of the Lubyanka was the shadow biography of Armand Hammer, the one he had spent millions of dollars trying to suppress. The documents discovered between 1993 and 1994 were meticulous, bureaucratic, and devastating. They did not describe a citizen diplomat or a peace broker. They described a logistical operative for the Soviet state. The files contained receipts and cables dating back to the 1920s that laid out the mechanics of Hammer's betrayal. They confirmed that his famous A. Hammer Pencil Company was not a profit-seeking enterprise for American shareholders. It was a money-laundering wash cycle. The archival evidence showed that the profits generated by the factory in Moscow were never intended to be repatriated to the United States as legitimate earnings. Instead, under direct orders from Soviet intelligence, the money was diverted into secret bank accounts in Berlin and London. These slush funds were then used to finance underground communist cells across Europe and the United States, pay for the legal defense of arrested spies, and support subversive activities. The documents proved that Armand Hammer was, in effect, the paymaster for the export of the Bolshevik Revolution. Even more chilling were the memos regarding his art dealings. The archives revealed that the sale of the Romanov treasures in American department stores in the 1930s was a state-sanctioned fencing operation. Hammer was not saving art. He was liquefying the stolen heritage of the Russian people to provide hard currency for Stalin's industrialization and his secret police, the NKVD. The savior of art was exposed as a partner in cultural genocide. While history was judging the father in Moscow, the son was facing his own final tragic unraveling in Los Angeles. Julius Hammer spent the years 1993 and 1994 in a state of bewildered poverty and paranoia. The revelation that his father's estate was insolvent had destroyed his last hope of financial independence. He was living in a modest rental, struggling with severe health issues and the psychological scars of a lifetime of abuse. He was the sole living repository of the family's secrets, but he was crumbling under the weight of them. Desperate for money, Julian attempted a final gamble. He possessed his own chaotic archive, boxes of personal papers, cassette tapes, and photographs he had salvaged from his father's house before Ray Arani changed the locks. He tried to monetize these secrets. He met with writers and television producers, hinting that he knew where the missing Romanov Easter eggs were hidden, or the codes to the secret bank accounts in the Cayman Islands that the IRS had never found. But Julian was a broken man. His stories were erratic, fueled by addiction and a deep, terrifying paranoia inherited from his father. He told friends that he believed his father had bugged his house, that he was still being watched by security. The tragedy was that, given Armand's history of surveillance, this paranoia was entirely rational. But Julian lacked the credibility or the focus to land a book deal. He was dismissed as the unstable son of a famous man, a footnote in a story that was rapidly being rewritten by the historians in Russia. As 1995 approached, the two tracks of the Hammer legacy, the geopolitical fraud and the familial tragedy, were converging. The secret dossier in Moscow was fully translated, ready to be published. And in Washington, D.C., the U.S. government was preparing to declassify a World War II-era intelligence program that would provide the final, irrefutable proof of Armand Hammer's treachery. The endgame was in sight. The year 1996 arrived as the final curtain call for the Hammer mythology. For 5 years following Armand's death, the dismantling of his reputation had been a slow, piecemeal process driven by lawsuits and rumors. But in 1996, two simultaneous events, one literary, one governmental, combined to deliver the death blow to his legacy, transforming him from a controversial tycoon into a confirmed traitor in the eyes of history. In October 1996, the biographer Edward J. Epstein published his magnum opus, Dossier, The Secret History of Armand Hammer. The book was not a standard biography. It was an indictment. Utilizing the newly accessible Comintern files he had unearthed in Moscow, Epstein laid out a timeline of betrayal that stretched back to 1921. The book provided the first comprehensive public accounting of how Hammer had laundered Soviet money through his pencil factories and art galleries. It detailed the specific mechanisms of the fraud, matching dates of Hammer's travel with the dates of cash transfers to Soviet spy rings. The publication of Dossier was a cultural event. It stripped away the last vestiges of the philanthropist persona. The reviews were devastating. The man who had spent millions trying to win the Nobel Peace Prize was now being described on the front pages of American newspapers as a master of deceit and a Lenin's man in Washington. The book forced institutions that still bore his name to reckon with the reality that their patron was likely a foreign agent. But the book was just the prelude. The confirmation came from the United States government. In late 1996, the National Security Agency, NSA, and the CIA completed the public declassification of the Venona project. This was a top-secret counterintelligence program that had intercepted and decrypted Soviet diplomatic cables during the 1940s. For 50 years, these intercepts had been America's most closely guarded secret. When the files were released, intelligence analysts immediately zeroed in on a specific Soviet agent operating in the United States during the Roosevelt era. The agent was referred to in the cables only by the codename the Capitalist. The Venona intercepts detailed how the Capitalist had met with Soviet handlers in New York, how he had facilitated the transfer of funds to pay for the legal defense of arrested spies, and how he had used his business cover to move sensitive information. The biographical details in the cables matched Armand Hammer's life with fingerprint precision. The dates of his travel, his business dealings with the distilling industry, his contacts in the Roosevelt White House, it was all there. The declassified files proved that J. Edgar Hoover's obsessive surveillance of Hammer in the 1940s and 50s had not been a witch hunt. It had been a competent counterintelligence operation that was stymied only by Hammer's immense political protection. The Bolshevik connection was no longer a theory. It was a documented historical fact, verified by the intelligence agencies of both superpowers. While the world was absorbing the truth about the father, the son reached the end of his own tragic road. Julius Hammer had spent the last months of his life in a state of accelerating decline. The stress of the estate battles, the poverty, and the resurfacing of the family's dark past had broken him. He had become a recluse in his rented home, surrounded by the debris of a life lived in the shadow of a narcissist. In May 1996, Julius Hammer died alone in Los Angeles at the age of 67. His death was a grim mirror image of his father's. Armand had died in a mansion, surrounded by doctors and flatterers, with the world's press waiting outside. Julian died in obscurity, his passing noted only by a few brief obituaries that identified him simply as the son of Armand Hammer. There were no state funerals, no eulogies from presidents. He was buried quietly. With him died the direct memory of the Brown House in Moscow, the first-hand accounts of the dinners with Lenin, and the terrifying reality of growing up as a prop in his father's theater. Julian's death left his daughter, Casey Hammer, as the sole survivor of the immediate dynasty. She was left to navigate the wreckage. She had inherited no fortune, only a name that was now synonymous with fraud and treason. The birthright she had been promised, the safety, the status, the legacy, had been stolen twice, first by her grandfather's greed, and then by history's revelation of his crimes. As 1996 came to a close, the demolition of the Hammer empire was absolute. The money was gone, siphoned off into the pockets of lawyers, or lost in bad debts. The company, Occidental Petroleum, had ruthlessly purged the founder from its corporate history. The museum was struggling for an identity. The family was dead or destitute. The emperor had built a monument of sand, and the tide of truth, rising from the archives of Moscow and Washington, had finally washed it all away. The story of Armand Hammer's life had ended, but the trauma he inflicted, the Hammer curse, remained, a radioactive inheritance that would fester in the silence until a new generation found the courage to speak. Is the Hammer curse real? The death of Julian Hammer in 1996 marked the end of the direct line to the Brown House in Moscow, but it did not mark the end of the Hammer drama. For nearly 2 decades following his passing, the family receded into a kind of restless obscurity. The fortune was gone, the patriarch was disgraced, and the surviving heirs were left to navigate a life defined by the absence of the money they had been promised. But the Hammer curse, that radioactive inheritance of control, perversion, and psychological violence, had not vanished. It had merely gone dormant, incubating in the next generation until it was ready to explode back into the public consciousness in a form that was even more grotesque than the financial crimes of the 20th century. In the 2000s, the name Hammer returned to the headlines, but this time it was attached to a face of Hollywood perfection. Armie Hammer, the great-grandson of Armand, emerged as a movie star. Tall, handsome, and charming, he seemed to embody the American dream version of the family myth that his great-grandfather had tried so hard to curate. He starred in prestige films like The Social Network, where he played the Winklevoss twins, and Call Me By Your Name. To the public, he was the scion of a golden dynasty, proof that the family had transcended its scandalous past. But in 2021, the facade collapsed with shocking speed. A series of allegations surfaced on social media, accusing Armie Hammer of sexual abuse, coercion, and, most disturbingly, fantasies involving cannibalism. Text messages leaked online, allegedly written by the actor, detailed desires to drink blood and eat partners. The scandal was surreal, a tabloid horror show that seemed too bizarre to be true. Armie Hammer denied criminal wrongdoing, claiming all interactions were consensual, but his career was instantly destroyed. However, for those who knew the history of the House of Hammer, these allegations were not an anomaly. They were an echo. Casey Hammer, Armand's granddaughter and Armie's aunt, stepped forward to provide the context that the tabloids were missing. In 2022, she participated in a searing documentary series titled House of Hammer and re-released her memoir, Surviving My Birthright. Casey's testimony was a forensic dismantling of the family's internal culture. She argued that the behavior attributed to Armie was not a random deviation, but the inevitable result of the environment Armand Hammer had created. She described a dynasty built on a foundation of absolute, unchecked male power, where the men were treated as gods who could take whatever they wanted: money, women, bodies, without consequence. She detailed the playbook of control that Armand had perfected and passed down to his son Julian and his grandson Michael, Armie's father. It was a playbook of surveillance where family members bugged each other's homes. It was a playbook of financial coercion where love was given and withdrawn based on obedience. And it was a playbook of sexual depravity where the women in the family were treated as props or obstacles. Casey revealed that her father, Julian, had sexually abused her as a child, a crime that was covered up to protect the family name. She described growing up in a gilded cage, terrified of the grandfather, who was receiving medals from presidents while orchestrating the psychological torture of his own kin. The 2021 scandal was, in Casey's analysis, the Hammer curse manifesting in the internet age. Armie Hammer was the product of 3 generations of men who had been taught that the rules of society did not apply to them. Armand had believed he was above the law because of his money. His descendants believed they were above morality because of their name. The fall of Armie Hammer was the final, cultural implosion of the dynasty. The name that Armand had wanted to be synonymous with peace was now, thanks to the internet, synonymous with cannibalism. While the family was disintegrating on Instagram and streaming services, the corporate empire Armand built was undergoing its own quiet, ruthless evolution. Occidental Petroleum spent the decades following Hammer's death engaging in a systematic program of de-Stalinization. Under the leadership of Ray Irani and his successors, the company worked tirelessly to erase the memory of its founder. The Armand Hammer boardroom was renamed. The portraits were taken down. The eccentric subsidiaries, the film studios, the horse farms, the cattle ranches, were sold off. Occidental refocused on the boring, profitable business of drilling for oil. It became a disciplined, modern energy giant, eventually acquiring Anadarko Petroleum in 2019 in a massive $38 billion deal that made it one of the dominant players in the Permian Basin. Today, Occidental is a pillar of the U.S. energy sector, a favorite investment of Warren Buffett. It is a company defined by engineering and geology, not by back-channel diplomacy and bribes, but in its corporate DNA, the scars of the Hammer era remain. The company still faces the long tail of legal liabilities from environmental cleanups, the ghostly echoes of Love Canal. And every time the company enters a new risky market, the shadow of the Libyan gamble hangs over the boardroom, a reminder of the risks of betting the company on the whims of a dictator. The Armand Hammer Museum in Los Angeles stands today as the final, ambiguous monument to his ego. For years after his death, it struggled for identity and funding, a vanity project without a patron, threatened with insolvency. But eventually it was taken over by UCLA. Today it is a respected institution of contemporary art. Ironically, it succeeded only by abandoning Hammer's vision entirely. It stopped focusing on his collection of old masters, many of which were sold off or revealed to be lesser works, and became a space for modern, progressive, and often political art. It is a museum dedicated to the kind of free expression that the Soviet Union would have crushed. The name Hammer remains carved in stone above the door, but the spirit inside has been thoroughly exorcised. The ultimate legacy of Armand Hammer is a lesson in the limits of money. He proved that with enough cash you can buy oil fields, you can buy politicians, you can buy museums, and you can even buy your freedom from a federal prison sentence. But you cannot buy the truth, and you cannot buy history. He spent 70 years constructing a monument to himself, a statue of a benevolent doctor who healed the world and bridged the gap between superpowers. But the moment he died, the statue crumbled, revealing the wireframe of lies underneath. He is remembered today not as a peacemaker, but as a predator, a man who poisoned the earth at Love Canal, betrayed his country for the Kremlin, and destroyed his own family for his ego. The House of Hammer stands empty, a gilded cage that trapped everyone who lived inside it. It serves as a dark parable for the 20th century, a reminder that the most dangerous thing a man can inherit is not debt, but a secret. The oil still flows, the art still hangs, but the family is broken, proving that while you can rewrite the past, you cannot escape it.